fiends, drunk on blood by the moonlight. The undead clawing their way out of rotting coffins. These are nightmarish images, but are there any truth to them? I'm Linnea Quigley here for Paranormal Truth. Let's find out.
Hello, my name is Patrick Allen, and this is Linnea Quigley's Paranormal Truth, a series of films where we delve into the paranormal world of the unknown. In this episode, we are going to investigate the world of the undead. Do vampires and zombies exist, or are they just the stuff of legend? As we proceed into this unknown world, we discover the dark history of suspected vampires like Vlad Tepes and Elizabeth Bathory, and uncover hidden voodoo rituals designed to make the dead rise from the grave, as depicted in horror films like Nosferatu, Night of the Living Dead, and White Zombie.
Are vampires real? Do you mean, are there people who turn into bats and live forever? Well, no, of course not. But are there people who consume human or animal blood? Are there people who take what they call psychic energy from people? Well, yes, there are, and they call themselves human vampires or real vampires. Before they start doing that, though, they usually, just after puberty, begin feeling energy deficient. They feel sluggish. They feel like they can't maintain anything close to a healthy or energized lifestyle. And eventually, usually by accident, they come in contact with someone else's blood, like in a fight. Or they buy some meat that has some blood-tainted residue in it. And after consuming either or blood, they feel better. They feel energized. They feel like the people around them. After they realize they need blood or energy to feel sustained and energized, they need to continue that process. So they find donors through networks, through networking with other real vampires. And when they find someone who might be, susceptible to this idea, they have their blood tested. The vampire has his or her blood tested. And once it's discovered that things are relatively safe, they will take the blood or energy of this person on a weekly basis. The United States has at least a couple of thousand real vampires. A lot of them live in major cities: Atlanta, New York City, New Orleans, LA, Austin. So should you be scared of real vampires? Well, no. They're not harmful. They're not going to attack you. In fact, they're some of the nicest people I've ever met. And more than likely, you actually know a few, or you've met a few in real life. And some of you may even come in contact with them on a daily or weekly basis, depending on where you live.
Everybody wants to be pretty. Everybody wants to be appealing and mysterious and like, ooh, I'm so like, all these added things. So it's mostly for the glamour. Is expressing a different part of yourself that you're not able to like, do throughout the rest of your day. So like, you end up like carrying yourself in different ways because like, it's fucking hot right now. Okay, that's what I need you to do. Take your panties and hook them up under your lip like you make your face in grade school. There you go, and say ah, a little bit more. And what I need you to do now, I need you to close naturally and slowly until I say stop, okay? Okay, open back up, ah, good. Okay, you can put your lip down. There you go.
What attracted you to the vampire subculture in the first place?
I've always been a bookworm, like, heavy into mythology. And like, the different forms of spirituality and stuff like that. So just to be around people that like, wow, you have a similar reading list, we can actually talk. So just like wanting to find like a niche where like you're appreciated and you don't feel like you're just that token kid. Okay, can you sit back down, please? Oh boy, I'm sorry, honey.
I don't want to breathe it.
I know. Also keep in mind you're in Jersey, so God knows what else you're breathing. And you have these in your mouth, you start speaking, like people are just like, wait a minute, something's wrong. That primal part of your brain goes off and it's like, wait, okay, don't run right now because they can smell fear. There have been times that I've had guys like, yo, Mom saying, what's good? You looking kind of cute. And I'm like, hey, what's good? And I'm not like acting like this, like, hey, what's going on? Blah, blah, blah. And they're just like, yo, you have a good night, And then they back off, you know what I mean? So it was like, So many times fangs have inevitably saved my ass. You kind of have to let people know from a distance you're not meant to be fucked with.
I think they're doing pretty good.
So I can't wear them with my retainer?
No. No eating and no sleeping with these on, period. And there are no dumb questions. I had this one guy ask me, he was just like, how about meth? And I was just like, well, as far as I know, that you shouldn't have any problems, but if anything changes color, let me know, so that way I'll put an aftercare rule sheet. Whatever you do, don't smoke meth with these on, because it'll turn them green. So, every so often you're going to need to clean these because the acrylic is porous. Let it soak in Listerine or any antibacterial mouthwash, again, yellow or clear. Do intervals of a minute and a half bath. Don't boil it.
Oh wow, they're tight.
Yeah, but still, they're not as tight as they could be.
That's totally fine though,
In modern times, the undead are mythological beings that are dead, but are able to act as if they are still living. The most common example of someone undead is the dead body resurrected by unnatural magic, fueled by either the life essence of the recently deceased or the will of some other entity. The undead can take many forms, be they spiritual like ghosts or spirits of all sorts, or physical in the shape of zombies or vampires. The concept of undead beings is a global phenomenon, appearing in many fictional works over the last several centuries. The idea of reanimated beings dates as far back as 701 BC, with the ark demonize Lilith or Lila to the world. Undead can also refer to instances of more mundane resurrection, such as the experiments performed by Robert E. Cornish on the process of cryonics. The modern definition of undead can almost be fully attributed to Bram Stoker and his novel Dracula, published on May 26, 1897. Though when Bram Stoker used the term undead in his novel, he used it only when describing vampires.
My name's Damien. I'm a vampire. This is my story. Real vampires today are connected to the legend by certain things. Legends of vampires in the past have to do with drinking blood and or in this case, now it's life force.
I know a client who was involved with a creature of the night. This individual was working on things and realized this object of the night gave him a sense of power.
If the donor is a good bleeder, then it's easy to tell the amount that's coming into my mouth. It's like taking a shot. Go get you a shot of bourbon, and if the bleeder is good, that's what it's like.
This is Balthazar. He's a blood-drinking vampire. And this is Dana, one of his blood donors.
When I do my feeding, I like to use an X-Acto knife. It just makes a nicer, neater cut.
Balthazar feeds up to 4 times a week from several donors. He insists on using a new blade each time.
So it's very important, especially for the health of the donor and for the trust of the donor to see that they're getting a clean blade.
There are blood-drinking vampires across the country, but you may not recognize them. Unless, of course, you're in New Orleans.
A lot of people don't wear them at all. I wear them when I'm in New Orleans because I am expressing my happiness at being able to walk around here out of the coffin, per se. One of the things that we believe is that you are a born vampire. You cannot decide to be one, and you cannot be turned. Either you are born vampire and that's your nature, or you're not.
I consider myself a HLV, that's a human living vampire. So yes, I'm a real vampire. I drink blood. I psi feed, which means I can feed psychically. Well, in Alaska, it's not very acceptable. There's a lot of people that don't understand it.
It's not something that you can go around telling people, hey, I'm a vampire, because they think you're crazy.
But on Halloween weekend in New Orleans, there is no crazy. so vampires flock here. And where there are vampires, there will be blood, preferably human blood.
I know my fangs and claws to the shadows of yours. Blood tastes good, smells good, feels good in the mouth. There is nothing else like it.
Dana has been feeding vampires since she was in her teens. She does it for the spiritual connection.
They need that energy that we supply them. I'm a key to the vampire's survival. Without me, or people like myself, they starve, to put it lightly. So they do like to keep me close, keep me safe. It's nice to have friends that will protect you.
One more. Ooh, she's a good bleeder. The easiest way to describe the feeling, I have energy, I have life.
There are many notable 19th century stories about the horrifying undead, including Ambrosia Pierce's The Dead of Halprin Fraser, and many Gothic Romanticism stories from the writings of Edgar Allan Poe. The haunting stories of Beers and Poe would end up being heavily influential later on. Writers such as H.P. Lovecraft and Anne Rice.
About Lestat, when I wrote Interview with the Vampire, I was thinking about Louis. I mean, Louis was the hero. Everything revolved around Louis. Louis was me. I was Louis. I'm the only woman ever played by Brad Pitt in a movie. But I was truly Louis. That was me. And Lestat just sprang to life in the corner of my eye. I mean, this character took on all this ferocious life. Now, whether, what that came from in my own life experience, whether that was my husband's presence, his vitality, I'm not sure. But when characters come to life that way, they leave behind all the influences. I never sat down and thought, well, this is based on my husband Stan, or this is what Stan would do. I had an idea of Lestat as the man of action, the man who could do things that I couldn't do, the man who could make decisions that I never had the nerve to make, and the person who could go through life joyfully in spite of the questions that torment me, the doubts that torment me, the horror of death that torments me. And of course, that was tied up with the idea that he was an 18th century personality. He was from the age of reason. He was much more rational, much more cynical in some ways than Louis. Louis was more a naive, romantic character, much more, I think, 19th century. All of that was working in my mind. Not that the Romantic period is limited to the 19th century, certainly not, starts in the 18th, but still, Lestat represented the Enlightenment. He represented a different view on things. He's also inherently a comic character in the sense of always triumphing and always coming back and never being really destroyed. He never really absorbs a tragic definition of himself for very long. He always comes back laughing, at everything and just rebounding. It may take him a few years, but he always does it. But what all went into that, I don't know, other than the fact that I really wanted to explore a personality that was different from my own. And so he became a kind of dream version of what I'd like to be. He was the man I wanted to be. He was the person I wanted to be. I wanted his strength. And once he became a living character, I never had to consciously steer him in any direction. It was just a matter of getting into Lestat, and then he'd go, and he'd take me where he wanted in the novel. I never had to worry about his dialogue or what he was going to say. My knowledge of him was so complete and so instinctive that I could just write. I mean, the other characters I might have to think about where they were coming from, what they had to say and so forth. Not him. It was almost, I still feel this way about him. I haven't written a page you know, with Lestat since 2002, but I know exactly what he thinks about everything. If I walk into a theater and see a play, I know whether he likes it or not. If I watch an opera, I know whether he loves that opera. If we go visit a city, I know what he thinks of that city. You know, I'll never be away from him. He'll always be part of me.
Vlad Tepes, known as Vlad the Impaler, is to be treated with caution because his brutal acts were very probably exaggerated, or even invented by the Saxons. Books with woodcuts on their title pages that depicted several different horrific scenes. For instance, the editions published in Nuremberg in 1499 and Strasbourg in 1500 try to show Vlad dining at a table surrounded by dead or dying people on poles. Stoker borrowed the name and scraps of miscellaneous information about the history of Vlad the Impaler while writing his book about Count Dracula. Now we come to the end of the story of Vlad Tepes as we try to understand his death and burial. The place of his burial is completely unknown. According to tradition, Vlad was buried in a monastery in Snagov. Excavations carried out in 1933 found no tomb below the supposedly unmarked tombstone of Vlad Tepes. There was no tomb, only many bones and jaws of horses. The vampire was the most popular undead creature for well over a century, far outshining zombies, mummies, reanimated corpses, and other dwellers of the thinly veiled space between life and death. In many ways, it is fair to admit that there has been a shift in the modern focus of humanity's favorite undead creatures. Gone is a time of a sophisticated and graceful undead, which Dracula has been from time to time.
Vlad Tepes, actually Vlad the Third, because with a name like Vlad, you just pass it on from generation to generation. He's a 15th century prince of Wallachia, not Transylvania. Wallachia is actually south of Transylvania, if anybody, no one cares. His father, Vlad II, became known as Vlad Dracula once he was made part of the Order of the Dragon, which was an organization of noblemen who determined to rebuff the Ottoman invasion. Vlad III, who was son of Vlad II, was also sometimes called son of Dracula or Dracula. That's where the name came from. And in fact, in the novel, Van Helsing said he must indeed have been that Voivode Dracula who won his name against the Turk. And for many people, that's it. Solved, we're done. Good night, everybody. Except we're not. Dracula from Stoker's novel bears very little resemblance to the historical figure. And in fact, Stoker had been working on the novel for years before he even knew who Dracula was. Stoker took 7 years to write the novel. For the first 4, it was called Count Vampire. Not the most original title. Later, he titled the novel The Undead, and it was his publisher who insisted at the last minute, we need a better title. Let's call it Dracula. But we do know that about 4 years into the writing of this novel, Stoker went into the public library in Whitby, and he read, I have to go to my cheat sheet here for a name, he read an account of the principalities of Wallachia and Moldavia, where it mentioned Vlad and his name Dracula. And we know from his journal that he even got the name wrong, because he writes in his journal, Dracula means the devil. Not really, except that it means son of the dragon, and the dragon sometimes is a metaphor for the devil, but you're really having to work to get there. In fact, if you look at the physical description alone, you see that this doesn't look like the sole image we have of Vlad III. Dracula is described as a tall, old man, clean-shaven save for a long white mustache, and clad in black from head to foot, without a single speck of color. His face was strong, very strong, aquiline, with high bridge of a thin nose, and peculiarly arched nostrils, with lofty domed forehead and hair growing scantily around the temples. That sounds so much more noble than receding hairline, doesn't it? But profusely everywhere else. His eyebrows were massive, almost meeting over the nose, and with bushy hair that seemed to curl in its own profusion. As his lips ran back over his gums, the long, sharp canine teeth shone out strangely. So I was looking for pictures of Dracula that matched the novel's description, and I found that there is a company right now who is issuing a resin model based on the description from the novel, and I think it's a pretty good one. There. I bet that's not the image you had in your mind. And it's not that.
The first vampire film of any note is Nosferatu in 1922, starring Max Schreck as the vampire and directed by F.W. Murnau. Due to copyright problems with the Stoker estate, the film's title was changed from Dracula to Nosferatu. Next we have the flesh eaters, the undead, the zombie. You may be surprised to know that your favorite flesh-eating creatures are based on some very real history. The island of Haiti in the 17th and 18th centuries. Zombies are what English professor Amy Wellens calls a New World phenomenon. The zombies of the 1968 film Night of the Living Dead had a hunger for flesh. In 2012, the New York Times described how modern ideas about zombies arose from the blending of old African religious beliefs and the pain of slavery that defined Haiti before it gained independence from France in the 19th century. In certain traditional African religions, people believed that a human soul can be stolen from the body and be bottled up for later use.
Everyone in the world is aware of the term zombie. They know what zombie movies are about. Living people dealing with a slow-moving plague of the undead. The story is often about survivalism and about the fact that the living people are actually the scary ones. My name is Tim Steele. I am a comic book artist, and I'm here to talk to you about the history of zombies. The origin of the term zombie actually goes back to the 17th century, Haiti, before Haiti was even Haiti. And Haiti was a destination for slaves from Africa brought by the French. They were treated really poorly and often worked to death. So part of their mythology was this idea that if you try to get away from the suffering of slavery and committed suicide, you would be forced to do work and be a slave for all of eternity. So the idea of the zombie actually comes from this sort of hellish afterlife in which you lumbered around with no direction and were forced to work forever. The legend sort of morphed into being the zombie was a undead figure who was often an assistant or a slave to a shaman, which is called a bokor. The first time it sort of shows up in American pop culture is a Bela Lugosi movie from 1932 called The White Zombie. A voodoo sorcerer resurrects a white guy and he becomes this undead monster, and hence the term white zombie. The term doesn't really show up much after that until I Am Legend, which eventually got turned into the Will Smith movie. Even though the monsters are not called zombies, it's really the sort of first zombie story. In 1968, when George Romero made a movie called Night of the Living Dead, he used and was inspired by the original Richard Matheson I Am Legend story. He never uses the term zombies, actually. In the original screenplay, they're called ghouls. The idea of this plague of the unliving menacing the dead really kind of gained notoriety with that movie. And one of the reasons everyone on Earth has seen or knows about Night of the Living Dead, the distributor forgot to put a trademark and copyright on the film. So when they showed the movie, it passed into public domain. Late-night cable stations around the country would run it and not have to pay anything. And that kind of set up the familiarity with this idea. Then in 2003, a comic book writer by the name of Robert Kirkman teamed up with his friend Tony Moore, and they came up with The Walking Dead. And the pitch on The Walking Dead was, you know those zombie movies about people surviving in a zombie apocalypse world? It never ends. And that was the pitch of The Walking Dead. One of the interesting things about zombies is there's two different forms of escapism going on in the zombie story and abilities to relate. And I think one of those is people sort of fantasize to a degree about living in a world of which all the pains of your everyday life are gone and you have to survive by your wits alone. And I think the other one is mass conformities. Join us, become one of us. All you have to do is get bitten and you can throw away your cares and you can wander around with us. And having access to horror stories gives you a way to control fear. You can enter into something scary and then you can leave it. You've just controlled that fear. which I think is a great psychological exercise in dealing with constant fear and anxiety. I think zombies specifically because, to me, it was always the idea that really the society you live in is barely held together.
Vampires from centuries past. Zombies, voodoo, the undead, and Haitian origins. Now let's hope they stay in the past and on the silver screen. Now, if you excuse me, I just got a call, something about a busted chemical drum. Ooh.